The reframing of Aegon II's coronation towards the end of House of the Dragon's first season put an interesting, although not necessarily plausible spin on Aegon's kingship in the world of Ice and Fire. However, the Greens' decision to put Aegon on the Iron Throne was a mistake, just not in the way that most people think. One of the most compelling aspects of the Dance of the Dragons is that from an actual leadership perspective, neither Aegon or Rhaenyra are particularly well suited for the throne. The Greens taking the Iron Throne while they still had the home court advantage was somewhat understandable. But when two possible but inept leaders are in a sort of race to the bottom, then strategically speaking, letting the Blacks fail on their own was likely a better opportunity than just taking the Iron Throne for themselves and making themselves into an enemy that can cause people who would not side with Rhaenyra under any other circumstances to unite behind her. Because although her rulership isn't necessarily good for them, she is at least a more prudent or beneficial option for them than Aegon and the Greens. One of the most bafflingly, often underestimated aspects of the Greens as a political faction is the fact that they have the force of House Hightower and Oldtown behind them. There is undoubtedly a massive advantage to having control over the two biggest cities in Westeros by a mile. So in that sense, it's not surprising that the Greens were reluctant to give that hegemonic power up. But although this is hardly a guaranteed strategy, they may have been better off by simply letting Rhaenyra fail on her own rather than going to war with her, especially when the stronghold of Oldtown is such an enormous force of Westerosi power. Undeniably, one of Rhaenyra's biggest political missteps before her father's death was not actually creating any significant political foundation for her own rule in the future. Staying isolated on Dragonstone and failing to engage with the lords that she was expecting to lead was a huge mistake on her part, especially given that they were unaccustomed to being ruled by a woman and likely expected her to be fundamentally incapable of leading anyway. However, there was a significant upshot to her isolation that would have severely undermined her rule had she actually been able to take the throne as soon as Viserys was dead. The ability to keep the strong boys out of the public eye was a huge advantage that her years on Dragonstone granted her, and forcing her children to become some of the obvious faces of the Iron Throne's future would have likely benefited the Greens had they just allowed that to happen. Unsurprisingly and unfairly, the expectations for Rhaenyra as a ruling queen would have been low, and many of her supporters were mostly driven by the fact that they had made oaths to her father when he declared her his heir that they are now reluctant to break. Frankly, a significant number of those supporters likely would have been looking for a reason to pull their support for her, as a ruling class that concentrates nearly all of its power in the hands of men would undoubtedly love a reason to undermine any female rule and any potential arguments for future female inheritance. And unfortunately for Rhaenyra, she would have given them pretty obvious cause to accuse her of essentially being the first to break the feudal contract by attempting to seat bastards on the Iron Throne. But even more unfortunately for Rhaenyra, she made a massive misstep by having obvious bastard children. And then she essentially made that problem exponentially bigger by brutalizing and even murdering those who pointed out that she was committing treason by treating bastard strongs as legitimate Valyrians. Again, this was a mistake that the Greens should have taken advantage of, but really didn't. Although they did occasionally point out and try to exploit Rhaenyra's mistake here, they likely would have been better off if they had allowed others to take that hit for them. In Fire and Blood, the bastardy of Rhaenyra's older sons isn't quite as clear, but House of the Dragon is making it a very plain fact. And, because Rhaenyra both clearly lies about her son's parentage and very violently punishes anyone who speaks out against them, she has essentially lied herself into a corner that she can't get out of. But ironically, the Green faction taking the throne outright basically pushes this potentially catastrophic issue for the Blacks to the back burner. Had Rhaenyra actually been forced to push Jace to the forefront as the future heir to the Iron Throne, the problem would have become more apparent to everyone, likely to the point where she would actually have to address it or where she would have to act out violently towards enough high-powered people that it would destabilize her rule and create a natural groundswell of support for Aegon as the heir who has already been usurped of his birthright in the eyes of many. However, even if things didn't happen this way, there were very serious cracks in Rhaenyra's faction that could have grown into chasms had the Greens actually let things unfold naturally and not been so immediately proactive to take the throne as soon as Viserys was dead. After all, one of the strongest and most important supporters for the Blacks was House Velaryon, whose loyalty was more than questionable and who may have taken Rhaenyra's side essentially because she was their best chance at maintaining or increasing their own power at the time, but who almost certainly would have been working against her in the long run. Corlys and Rhaenys may have been pragmatic and looking out for what remained of their own direct bloodline when it came to their allegiance with Rhaenyra, but they certainly wouldn't have trusted her. Nor does it seem likely that they would have actually stayed on her team for a variety of reasons. Firstly, House Velaryon is obviously one of the biggest and most powerful families in Westeros at the time. And although Corlys and Rhaenys were at the head of it, they were certainly the only members of said family who were actually acting in Rhaenyra's interests. And they were almost certainly doing that solely because they could see some benefit to Baela and Rhaena at the time. It'll be interesting to see how House of the Dragon handles this going forward, because it's pretty much unbelievable that any member of House Velaryon was fighting for the Blacks with the end goal of Rhaenyra taking the Iron Throne for good. Most people suspect that she was involved in the murder of Laenor, the heir of the house, and although Vaemon's death differs in the book and TV series, Rhaenyra and Daemon are clearly responsible for his murder in both. And he was essentially killed to intimidate others into staying silent about Rhaenyra committing treason. And although House of the Dragon has either omitted or not introduced this particular storyline at this point, a significant number of Velaryons are mutilated and left alive as a result of their discussion of the strong boy's bastardy. And they unsurprisingly actively work against Rhaenyra after being brutally punished for speaking the truth. So even if Corlys and Rhaenys were genuinely on Rhaenyra's side for some inexplicable reason, they would still have to answer to the rest of their family regarding why they're willing to side with a woman who was responsible for the unjust murder of their own kin. As far as they know, Baela and Rhaena are the last of their direct descendants, so making political moves in their favor makes sense. However, allowing House Velaryon to be usurped by a male heir who is not a Velaryon would undoubtedly be extremely controversial, and a good number of the family would be unlikely to let that usurpation slide just because Corlys and Rhaenys' granddaughters could reap some hollow benefit from it. So on that basis alone, it seems obvious that the Velaryons were always going to turn on Rhaenyra at some point. And on that basis alone, the Greens should have given them the opportunity to actually follow through on that, instead of essentially making themselves into a rival who can do even less to benefit Corlys and Rhaenys than Rhaenyra can. Similarly, although the Royces are a far less important or valuable house in the grand scheme of Westerosi politics, the fact that Daemon is also implicated in the death of his first wife and is attempting to claim her inheritance is a fissure that the Greens would have been wise to take advantage of and let grow independently before seizing power for themselves. Not only would such a situation sow dissatisfaction among the people of the Vale, but if the people of Westeros at large were actually confronted with the reality that a king and queen who appear to have had their spouses murdered, and who are openly committing treason and willing to kill anyone who actually points that out, the kingdoms probably would have had a much easier time backing Aegon, regardless of any oaths that they may have made to Viserys. Obviously, oath-keeping and oath-breaking is a social contract that can mean literal life or death in the world of Westeros. As demonstrated by Lucerys' ill-fated journey to Storm's End, Rhaenyra was relying on the support of House Baratheon because Boros Baratheon's father swore to her father that he would support her. But if Rhaenyra continued to demonstrate her inability to hold up her end of the social contract, it would have been a huge boon for the Greens, especially if they had distinguished themselves as reliable, trustworthy oath-keepers by not seizing the throne. Ultimately, the fatal flaw of both Rhaenyra and Aegon is that they are not particularly talented leaders, nor are they equipped to do the job. Rhaenyra mostly learned her political cues from her father, whose tried-and-true method of ameliorating political issues was pretending that they didn't exist. And Aegon essentially knows nothing about politics at all. But ironically, one of the most appealing aspects about Aegon before the dance began was that he was so uninvolved in politics that the world didn't know how bad he was at ruling, while Rhaenyra had already gotten the ball rolling and largely ensured that her reign couldn't last even if she managed to take the throne at some point. Before Viserys was even dead, Rhaenyra had made enough missteps and her inheritance was already questionable enough that her reign was largely doomed to fail sooner or later, and it probably would have been in the best interest of Alicent and her children to simply let that unfold. The addition of Alicent's misunderstanding about the prophecy that Viserys spoke of right before he died clearly changed the course of the story either way. But in a sense, it is somewhat surprising that Otto was planning on crowning Aegon regardless of Viserys' wishes. Not because it wasn't in his best interest in the grand scheme of things, but because there were so many other people who likely would have done House Hightower's dirty work and undermined and eventually overthrown Rhaenyra if he had just given them the opportunity to. Of course, Allowing Rhaenyra to develop any kind of stronghold in King's Landing was a risk, but seizing the Iron Throne may have been riskier, as Rhaenyra's actions and her bastard sons guaranteed that a crisis was coming no matter what. The Greens taking an offensive strategy rather than a defensive one isn't enormously shocking, but allowing Rhaenyra and Daemon to erode their own alliance likely would have been the easier tactic. What's more, by making the first move, the Greens actually strengthened many of the connections that would have naturally collapsed between the Blacks and their allies. Ironically, because the Greens and Blacks are both factions who are advocating for leaders that are completely ill-equipped to lead, letting their rival fail first would have benefited the Greens in the long run, and that is why crowning Aegon II was likely their biggest mistake. But what do you think? Were the Greens smart to take the Iron Throne while they had the chance? And would Rhaenyra have rallied and become a better leader rather than digging her own grave? Leave your comments and opinions below, and if you're interested in more content like this, like and subscribe.